My phone buzzed with a text from my attorney that read, "Plain as day, call me immediately." And in that moment my stomach lurched like I was standing on a cliff, because I knew deep down that no good news starts with a lawyer urging you to pick up the phone. I had been smoothing a dish towel over a cooling rack after baking cornbread, the smell of butter still hanging in the air, when those 5 words knocked the breath out of my 68-year-old body. By the time I dialed his number, my hands were damp and shaking, and I stared at the coffee maker's digital clock, watching each second blink as if it were counting down to some unseen disaster. His voice was calm but firm as he told me he needed to meet me in person, immediately, because he had discovered something about my daughter Monica that he couldn't trust to say over the phone, and every part of me clenched. Before I tell you what he said, please take a moment to subscribe so that you're the first to listen to these new stories as I post them here on the channel, and click the like button to show other moms with grown-up kids that we're all in this together. In those seconds before he fully explained, my mind cycled through everything I had ever done for her, from the nights spent rocking her when she had colic to the years of paying her bills and covering their mortgage payments, and I wondered what could possibly make my attorney sound so grave. As I slid my feet into the worn slippers by the back door, the ones I had bought at a department store last winter because they were on sale and my ankles needed support, I felt years of maternal trust start to crumble. I left a note on the kitchen table for my neighbor Carol, telling her I had an errand, and I clutched my purse like a lifeline as I drove toward his office, the smell of my car's upholstery mixing with the scent of panic. Orange County was bathed in that mid-morning glare, all palm fronds casting striped shadows across the asphalt, but the bright light only made the dark knot in my stomach tighter, and I kept asking myself if I had been blind. Over the years, I had turned my tiny mid-century bungalow into a comfortable home, mortgage paid off through decades of nursing shifts and overtime, and I had never imagined that the greatest threat to my security would come from my own flesh and blood. Monica had always had expensive tastes, even when she was young and insisted on designer shoes in high school, yet I chalked it up to youthful vanity, never guessing that entitlement could mature into something far more dangerous. When she married Alistair, a man whose charm was as polished as his fancy watch, I was hopeful he would anchor her ambitions to reality, but instead they seemed to amplify one another's sense of deserving more. They bought a house far too big for their income and filled it with things they couldn't afford, and every time their debt collectors called, they turned to me with pouting lips and the promise that I'd see my grandson if I helped them out. I had been paying their mortgage payments for 5 years, telling myself it was temporary, telling myself I was keeping a roof over Max's head, and yet with every check I wrote, I felt a little more invisible in their lives. The first time Monica ever threatened that I wouldn't see Max again if I didn't pay, we were standing by my kitchen sink, and she curled her manicured fingers around her coffee cup and whispered that I was making things difficult, and those words lodged deep like a splinter. I remember the smell of lavender detergent from the dishcloth in my hand, and I can still hear the quiet tick of the wall clock as I forced myself to agree to yet another loan, thinking I was preserving peace, but maybe I was enabling disrespect. So when my lawyer asked me to come in, the relief that someone else finally saw a crack in the facade battled with the dread that the crack might be a chasm. And I kept thinking about the last time I had signed papers Monica placed in front of me. She had said it was just to simplify things, that it would make paying bills easier, but the pages had so many lines of legal language that my eyes glazed, and because I trusted my daughter and my son-in-law, I signed without reading every word, something I would come to regret. When I pulled into the parking lot of his small office suite, the sky seemed to press down on me, and I noticed a group of sparrows hopping across the sidewalk, free and oblivious, and I wished I could be as unburdened. Inside, the receptionist offered me water, but my throat was too tight to swallow, and when my attorney ushered me into his office and closed the door, his expression told me more than any preamble could. He unfolded a copy of my house deed, my signature visible at the bottom, but above it a typed addendum had been inserted, listing Monica and Alistair as joint owners with the right of survivorship, and he explained that someone had filed this with the county recorder without my knowledge. I felt my hands go cold as he told me he had discovered the filing because the bank had sent him a duplicate of the updated deed when I refinanced my home loan through Chase earlier that month, and the fraud alert from the bank's system had flagged the change. According to him, California is what legal folks call a two-party consent state, meaning that you can't record a private conversation without all parties agreeing, so he couldn't exactly confront them by secretly taping a confession, but he suggested we gather paper evidence instead. More importantly, he explained that altering a deed without permission was a felony, and he told me the county probate court would treat any property transfer with suspicion, but we would need to move quickly before they tried to sell or borrow against my home. As he went over the timeline, he reminded me that probate and civil cases can take months or even more than a year, noting that state law expects completion within 1 year of a personal representative's appointment or 18 months if a federal estate tax return is required, and I felt a knot of dread about the coming fight. He slid a printed bank policy across the desk, highlighting a clause I had never noticed that said the bank could require advance notice for large cash withdrawals and could even demand that an armored carrier handle the funds at the customer's expense. And he pointed out that this would make it harder for them to drain accounts in a hurry. We decided then that I would contact the bank and freeze any joint access, change my online passwords, and alert the fraud department because trust, once broken, must be replaced by process, and I needed to protect myself. When I left his office, I sat in my Toyota Camry in the parking lot with my forehead pressed against the steering wheel, and I could taste the metallic fear in my mouth like I had bitten my tongue as tears blurred the dashboard. I thought about the man I married 40 years ago and how he had worked overtime at the grocery warehouse to pay down that mortgage, and I thought about the hours I spent in rubber-soled nursing clogs, catching babies and comforting the dying, and I asked myself how I had raised a child who would steal. I turned on the air conditioning, listening to the click as the old unit kicked in, and I reminded myself that I wasn't powerless, that decades of experience had taught me to be resourceful, and that this time I would not let guilt override good sense. The first thing I did was drive straight to the county recorder's office, my heart beating like a drum, and I requested a certified copy of the fraudulent deed so I would have proof, my fingers gripping the counter as the clerk disappeared into the back. The clerk returned with a stack of printouts and a form I needed to fill out to request an investigation, and as I filled in my information, I felt as if each pen stroke was reclaiming a piece of my autonomy. Back home, I brewed a strong pot of coffee and sat at my kitchen table under the ticking clock, reading the documents line by line, and the more I read, the more I realized how calculated the insertion of that addendum had been. They had slipped the new names into the document using language that mirrored the original deed, clearly hoping I wouldn't notice, and the notary seal looked legitimate, though my attorney suspected it might be fake. I scanned the signature carefully and saw my own handwriting there, captured as a duplicate from the original deed I signed years ago, which told me they had simply photocopied my signature and inserted it without my knowledge, an act that made me feel both violated and foolish. Anger burned behind my eyes, but it was mixed with a deep sadness that my daughter would conspire with her husband to cut me out of my own home, and I resolved to confront them, but not before I had every piece of evidence lined up. The next day, I took a walk with Carol down our tree-lined street, the scent of jasmine riding the breeze, and I told her in broad strokes what had happened. She squeezed my hand and said she had always felt something off about Alistair's slick charm. Carol reminded me of the time he had cornered her in my living room at Thanksgiving, bragging about a business deal while his eyes wandered toward my china cabinet as if appraising its worth. And I realized that small red flags had been there all along. I had chosen to ignore them because I wanted to believe my daughter was happy, and because I loved Max, a little boy who still ran into my arms with unrestrained glee, his hair smelling like sunshine and crayons. As we walked, we passed the local high school where Monica had once starred in the school play, and I thought about how she used to scribble hearts on her notebooks, and how I never expected those hearts to harden into cold calculation. That evening I sat down at my oak dining table and wrote a timeline, listing every payment I had made on their behalf, every time they asked for money, and every document I had signed, because my attorney said a clear record would be vital when we confronted them and, if necessary, when we stood before a judge. I pulled bank statements from my filing cabinet, each letterhead reminding me of the stability I had tried to provide, and as I sorted them into piles, I noticed something odd, a withdrawal I didn't recognize from a joint account we had opened years ago to manage my mother's funeral expenses, one that I had forgotten existed. The transaction was large and recent, and the note line simply said transfer, which made my blood run cold because I hadn't touched that account in months. I called the bank's customer service line, and after 30 minutes on hold listening to soft elevator music, a representative told me that Monica had initiated the transfer online using saved credentials. I asked how that was possible without my authorization, and she explained that because the account was joint, either party could withdraw funds unless both signatures were required, but the account had been set up with single signature authority. However, she noted that the bank would record my complaint and investigate. The representative also reminded me of the bank's policy about large cash withdrawals requiring advance notice and sometimes an armored carrier, which gave me some comfort that my daughter couldn't just empty my accounts without raising alarms. After that call, I logged into my online account and changed passwords, added multi-factor authentication, and removed Monica's user access, my fingers trembling but determined as I navigated the forms. I also set up text alerts for any transaction over $50 because if they tried again, I wanted to know immediately, and there was something empowering about using technology to protect myself, even if I still preferred paper receipts. That night, alone in my quiet house, I sat with an old photo album and flipped through images of Monica as a toddler smeared with cake frosting, a little girl sleeping on my chest, a high school graduate grinning in her cap and gown, and I let myself cry for what was being lost. I woke up early the next morning with puffy eyes and a steely resolve, and I spent the afternoon drafting a letter to Monica that didn't mention my evidence, but simply asked her and Alistair to come over for Sunday dinner, something we hadn't done as a family in months. Throughout the week, I went about my routine, mowing the lawn, paying bills, and even taking a trip to the grocery store, where I allowed myself a small indulgence from the bakery section because I knew I needed strength for what was coming. As I placed the bakery box on the conveyor belt, I noticed the cashier's ring beep, and I thought of the security system I planned to install later that day, a new Ring doorbell that would let me see who came to my front steps, even if I was in the backyard. Back home, I read the instructions carefully and installed the doorbell with a screwdriver, feeling a quiet satisfaction as I tested the video feed on my phone, because it meant that if anyone tried to approach my house unannounced, I would have a record. Later that afternoon, I drove to the hardware store to buy new deadbolts and a keypad lock, making sure to find a model with codes that could be changed easily, since I needed to revoke the key I had given Monica. And as I stood in the aisle, I ran into an old coworker who asked how my family was doing. I swallowed the urge to tell her everything right there under the fluorescent lights, and instead I smiled and said we were getting by, but inside a voice whispered that by Sunday my world might be entirely different. On Friday, Carol stopped by with a casserole and told me her nephew had once gone through something similar, and he had heard about it on a YouTube channel called Grace's Stories, where a gentle-voiced woman shared tales of betrayal and redemption that felt eerily familiar. I spent that evening searching for the channel, and as I folded laundry and sipped chamomile tea, I listened to a story about a mother whose adult son forged her signature on a loan, and the way the storyteller described the slow dawning of realization mirrored my own. Hearing that story on Grace's Stories made me realize I wasn't alone and gave me the courage to share my truth. As the video ended, the host gently reminded viewers to leave a comment about where they were listening from and to share their thoughts. And I thought about the power of community and how, for the first time in months, I felt less isolated. Saturday morning brought a text from Monica confirming Sunday dinner, peppered with smiley face emojis and no hint of the storm that was brewing, and I felt my heart both soften and harden at the same time. I spent the day cleaning the house, dusting the picture frames, and even making sure there was a coloring book and markers at the breakfast nook for Max, because no matter how angry I was at his parents, I didn't want to take anything out on him. That afternoon, I drove to the Big Box Wholesale Club to stock up on paper goods, and as I pushed the heavy cart down the aisles of Costco, I remembered how Monica used to love riding in the cart as a little girl, squealing when I wheeled her fast and my throat tightened. I passed the electronics section and saw a display of flat-screen TVs, each one brighter than the next, and I thought about how Monica and Alistair had insisted on a brand new set last Christmas, even though their credit cards were maxed out. I had ended up buying it because they said it would make Max happy. In the car on the drive home, the radio played an old Eagles song, and as the sun dipped behind the freeway overpass, I whispered to my late husband that I hoped he would guide me through whatever was coming. Sunday arrived clear and hot, and I roasted a chicken with rosemary and lemon, the smell filling the house. I set the table with my mother's china, partly because I wanted to remind myself of the women who came before me and partly to ground the conversation in something tangible. Around 3 o'clock, I heard the gravel crunch under tires, and I glanced at the ring notification on my phone, their SUV parked at a crooked angle in my driveway, and for a second I saw Max's face pressed against the window, his grin bright. I opened the door before they could ring, and Max barreled into me, hugging my waist, and for a moment the world narrowed to the weight of his 7-year-old arms around my middle and the warmth of his cheek against my belly. Monica swept in behind him, her perfume a little too strong, wearing a dress that looked expensive, and Alistair followed with the swagger of a man who had never been told no. They handed me a bouquet of grocery store flowers as if this were just another family dinner. As we sat at the table, I made small talk about the weather and Max's school projects, and I watched how Monica's eyes darted around the room, perhaps looking for paperwork or valuables. It was a habit I hadn't noticed before. After we finished the meal and Max took his dessert to the living room to watch cartoons, I cleared my throat and told them there was something we needed to discuss, and the atmosphere in the room shifted like a barometer before a storm. I slid the fraudulent deed across the table and told them that my lawyer had discovered it, and I asked them to explain. Monica's face drained of color, Alistair's jaw clenched, and there was a long silence broken only by the faint sound of cartoons from the other room. Monica stammered that it was a misunderstanding and that they had only been trying to ensure the house stayed in the family. But when I asked why they had filed the document without telling me, she couldn't meet my eyes. Alistair leaned back, his hand steepled, and said something about simplifying estate planning, but his voice had lost its usual oily smoothness, and there was a flicker of anger when he realized I wasn't swallowing his explanation. I told them I had talked to my attorney and that forging or altering a deed was illegal, a felony, and that if they tried to borrow against my house or sell it, the bank would stop them. I also told them I had removed their access to my accounts and changed the locks. I quoted the statute about California's two-party consent because I knew they might accuse me of recording our conversation, and I wanted to make it clear I respected the law, even if they didn't. Then I told them that I had been paying their mortgage for years, but no longer. I said I would no longer enable their spending, and that I was setting up a trust for Max that would be managed by a trustee until he was 25, with strict provisions preventing either of them from accessing the funds. Monica's mouth dropped open, and she sputtered that I couldn't cut her off, that I owed her for everything she had done. I asked her what she meant, because from where I sat, I had raised her, fed her, clothed her, and supported her, and the entitlement in her tone made my heart harden. Alistair slammed his hand on the table, his ring making a sharp crack against the wood, and he threatened to take me to court for elder abuse, a phrase he clearly didn't understand. I calmly told him that if he filed, the fraudulent deed would come to light and he could face charges. The word fraud seemed to hit them like cold water, and for a moment I saw fear pass over his face. He muttered something about needing to talk to his attorney, and I realized he had never expected me to fight back. Monica's anger shifted to tears, and she started sobbing about how I was choosing my house over her, how I was being cruel by withholding money. I reminded her that I wasn't cutting off love, only financial support, and that she was free to visit me with Max if she could respect boundaries. She threw the dish towel aside and said if I insisted on this, she would keep Max away from me. My chest constricted, but I had prepared for this possibility, and I told her I hoped she would reconsider, because punishing her child to hurt me was cruel. There was a long standoff in my kitchen, and the clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. Max wandered in with sticky fingers and asked if we could play with his trucks, oblivious to the storm swirling above his head. I smiled at him and wiped his hands with a napkin, and I realized I couldn't allow his parents' manipulation to control me any longer. I bent down and whispered that I loved him, and he grinned, unaware of the weight of the moment. When they left, Monica snatched Max's hand and stalked out, her shoulders rigid. Alistair didn't bother to look back. I watched their SUV reverse, my eyes watering, but my spine straight, because for the first time in years I had stood up for myself. That night I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of water, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, and I felt both empty and strangely proud. I knew there would be fallout, but I also knew I had drawn a line. In the days that followed, Monica sent me message after message, alternating between anger and pleading, promising visits and threatening lawsuits. I responded to none of them, directing everything to my lawyer because he had warned me not to engage emotionally. Alistair sent me a copy of a letter from his attorney, which was mostly bluster, but my attorney responded professionally, citing the fraudulent deed, the bank's investigation, and the legal consequences of forging documents, and after that I heard little more from them. The bank's fraud department called to confirm that they had flagged the attempted transfer and that they were investigating. They told me that they would report to law enforcement if they found evidence of forgery, and that gave me some peace of mind. Meanwhile, my attorney filed an affidavit with the county to invalidate the fraudulent deed and notified the district attorney's office. He said that because I had acted quickly and hadn't suffered financial loss, the district attorney might decide not to prosecute, but the document would be removed from the records. I changed my estate plan, updating my will to leave my house and savings to the trust for Max. We set the age of distribution at 25, with provisions for education and medical expenses, and we named my attorney as trustee to ensure my daughter couldn't access the funds. I also purchased a life insurance policy naming the trust as beneficiary, something I had been meaning to do for years. I chose a policy through State Farm, a company my parents had used, and the agent at the local office was respectful and understanding. During those weeks, I found solace in simple routines, taking my morning walk through the neighborhood, smelling the dew on the grass, and chatting with Carol about her roses. I found that focusing on the present helped keep me from ruminating on Monica's choices. I also started attending a support group at the community center for grandparents estranged from their grandchildren, and the stories I heard there were heartbreaking and empowering. There is something comforting about sitting in a circle with other women who know the sting of being cast aside. One woman told us about how she had been tricked into signing over her car, a beat-up Chevrolet Silverado she had nursed along for years, and how the police had told her there was little they could do because she had signed the title. Hearing her story reinforced that I had done the right thing by confronting the deed forgery head-on. As summer turned into fall, the leaves in our Southern California neighborhood barely changed colors, but there was a crispness in the evening air. I decorated my porch with pumpkins anyway, and I baked pies to take to the community center, allowing my hands to work while my mind slowly unclenched. Monica's messages grew less frequent, and eventually she stopped asking for money. Instead, she sent occasional photos of Max. his gap-toothed grin shining back at me from my phone screen, and I sent back heart emojis, careful not to engage in any discussion about finances. One afternoon, there was a knock on my door, and I looked through the Ring camera to see a man in a uniform. He introduced himself as a county investigator following up on the deed forgery, and he asked if he could interview me. I invited him in and answered his questions, showing him the documents my attorney and I had gathered. He explained that these cases sometimes take months, and sometimes the district attorney declines to prosecute because of limited resources, but that my report would remain on file. He asked if I had changed the locks and codes, and I told him I had replaced the deadbolts and installed a keypad lock, and he nodded, saying that abusers often try to access a victim's home or devices when confronted, so changing locks is a critical first step. His words validated my caution. He also asked about the value of my home and the amount taken from the joint account. I told him the approximate numbers, and he recorded them, reminding me that keeping track of amounts and dates could be important if charges were filed. After he left, I realized that I had begun to think in numbers, dates, sums, ages, years since my husband died, years since I last held Monica as my little girl, and this focus on detail grounded me in reality rather than emotion. I noticed that the local property values had climbed considerably, and I understood why Alistair and Monica had been tempted to steal. Houses in our neighborhood were selling for upwards of $900,000, far more than the $200,000 we paid decades ago, and greed can twist love. Still, I couldn't excuse their actions because love isn't about taking advantage. Love is about protection and honesty, and I wanted to model that for Max, even if he didn't understand yet. A week later, Monica sent a single-line email saying they were struggling with their mortgage now that I had stopped paying. She asked if I would at least help with one payment so they wouldn't fall behind and risk foreclosure. I stared at the screen for a long time. The old pattern in me wanted to rescue them, to protect Max from the stress of moving, but I remembered what my support group facilitator had said. Every time you bail someone out, you reinforce the idea that they don't have to change. I forwarded the email to my attorney without responding, and he drafted a neutral reply reminding them that I had made my decision. He also reminded them that if they fell behind, the bank might offer them options like loan modification, but those were their responsibility, not mine. Still, the thought of them losing their home weighed on me, and I decided to bring it to my therapist because I had started seeing one through my Medicare plan, and she helped me untangle the guilt from the responsibility. She reminded me that adults must face the consequences of their actions. During one session, I told the therapist that I missed my daughter, and I wondered if there had been a moment years ago where I could have set better boundaries. She listened and then said something that stuck with me. You cannot go back and reparent your adult child. You can only parent yourself now. I left that appointment feeling lighter, and on the way home I stopped at a Shell gas station to fill up my Camry. As I watched the numbers climb on the pump screen, I thought about the numbers I had been tracking in my life and how sometimes numbers can set you free. In the little shop connected to the station, I grabbed a bottle of water and a pack of gum, and the cashier asked if I wanted a receipt. I almost said no, but then remembered how important paper trails were, so I said yes and tucked it into my wallet. Later that week, I went to the pharmacy at Walgreens to pick up my blood pressure medication because all of the stress had sent my numbers soaring, and as the pharmacist slid the small white bag across the counter, he asked if everything was okay. I told him I was taking things one day at a time. He nodded and said his mother had gone through something similar, and he handed me my prescription and a packet about stress management. It's funny how many people have stories like mine once you start talking about it. As Thanksgiving approached, I wrestled with the idea of spending the holiday alone. Carol invited me to join her family, but part of me wanted to hold on to my own traditions. I decided to cook a small meal for myself and set an extra plate for my grandson, even if he wouldn't be there. I roasted a turkey breast, mashed potatoes, and made green bean casserole with Campbell's soup, a recipe my mother taught me. And as the gravy simmered, I felt a pang for the family dinners I had envisioned when I first bought this house. In the afternoon, Monica texted a photo of Max holding a paper turkey he had made at school, and for the first time she wrote, "We miss you," without any ask. I cried over the sink and sent a heart back. I decided to reply with an invitation to come by for pie the next day, but I added that I could not give them money. To my surprise, she agreed, and the next afternoon, she brought Max over for an hour. He ran into my kitchen and told me about his Thanksgiving, his blue eyes wide, and he tugged me toward the backyard to show me how he could do cartwheels. Monica stood by the door, arms crossed, glancing occasionally at the framed photo of her father I kept on the mantel. We sat on the porch and sipped sweet tea, and Monica said that their mortgage company had sent them a delinquency notice. She said she didn't know what to do. I told her they should talk to their lender and that I couldn't pay, and she bit her lip but didn't argue. She asked if there was any way she could access Max's trust to help with the mortgage, and I shook my head. I explained that the trust was for his future, and that any attempt to challenge it would trigger a clause disinheriting her entirely. She sighed and looked out at the rose bushes, and for a moment I saw my little girl again, the one who used to braid grass and tie it around her wrists as bracelets, and I wondered if there was still a path toward healing. Max clambered onto my lap and asked if we could bake cookies next week. I promised we would, and I felt a small bloom of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild our connection without me being their bank. Over the next months, Monica and I slowly began to repair our relationship, though it was nothing like before. We met at parks and neutral places where money wasn't a topic, and we played board games with Max, focusing on laughter rather than loans. Alistair rarely accompanied her, which was fine by me. Whenever he did come, he kept his distance and his eyes darted away from mine, and I suspected he resented that his financial pipeline had dried up. I noticed that Monica took on extra hours at her job, and she mentioned they were considering selling their house and downsizing to something more manageable. I told her I thought that was wise, and she didn't bristle at the suggestion. During one visit, she confessed that she had been angry with me because she felt I owed her something after years of raising her, and she realized she had been taking advantage. She said she wasn't ready to apologize fully, but she was thinking about it. I told her that was a start. I offered to help her create a budget, not by giving money, but by using my experience balancing finances on a nurse's salary. We sat at her kitchen table with notebooks and wrote down their income and expenses, and I saw her shoulders relax as numbers replaced anxiety. We used a calculator I had bought at Staples years ago, its buttons worn, and we added up mortgage payments, car payments, credit card bills, and groceries. For the first time, she saw how the $300 dinners at fancy restaurants were bleeding them dry. We also made calls to their bank, and the representative explained that while they could request a modification, the bank might require them to prove steady income and might place the loan into forbearance. Monica listened and took notes, and I saw her mind shifting from entitlement to accountability. I reminded her that banks are businesses and follow policies, like the one my attorney had shown me about large withdrawals requiring armored carriers. She laughed nervously and said she hadn't known that, and I said there was a lot she hadn't known. At one point, she asked if I had considered forgiving the fraudulent deed. I told her that I could forgive her as my daughter, but that the law still needed to acknowledge the wrong. I said forgiveness and accountability can coexist. She nodded, and though the conversation was hard, it felt like progress. We ended the budgeting session by going to the park with Max, who gleefully fed ducks and giggled when one splashed water on his shoes. Winter holidays came and went, and I spent Christmas morning at my friend Carol's house, sipping cocoa and watching her grandchildren tear open presents. I sent Max a gift through the mail, a set of classic children's books I had found at Barnes & Noble. On New Year's Eve, I reflected on the year, the betrayal, the confrontation, the lines drawn, and the slow thaw of my relationship with Monica. I realized that boundaries had allowed space for something more genuine to grow. I began volunteering at the local hospital again, rocking newborns whose mothers needed a break, and the act of cradling those tiny bodies reminded me of my purpose beyond being a mother and grandmother. I had value in my community. I also replaced the old analog thermostat in my house with a digital one. The Verizon technician who set up my internet had offered me a deal on a smart home package, and though I was hesitant about technology, I said yes because controlling my home made me feel safer. In March, my attorney called to say that the fraudulent deed had been officially expunged from the county record. He also said that the district attorney had decided not to press charges because I hadn't suffered financial harm, but that the documentation would remain on file if there were future issues. At first, I felt disappointed that there would be no legal consequences for Monica and Alistair, but then I realized the greater consequence for them was the loss of my trust and my financial support. Sometimes natural consequences are more effective than court rulings. I also realized that a courtroom battle would have cost time and money and might have further damaged any chance of rebuilding our relationship. The absence of criminal charges meant there was space to heal without the shadow of jail time. Meanwhile, the bank mailed me a letter confirming that they had closed the joint account and returned the remaining funds to me. They apologized for any inconvenience and included a brochure about protecting yourself from elder fraud, a small acknowledgement that this happens far too often. As spring warmed, I planted herbs in my backyard, basil, rosemary, mint, and I found pleasure in watching them sprout. I invited Max to help me water them, and he delighted in the earthworms wriggling in the soil. Monica came by more frequently, never asking for money. Sometimes she would bring over leftover pastries from her job at a local bakery, and we would sit at the kitchen table with coffee and talk about recipes and television shows instead of loans and deeds. She told me one day that they had sold their big house and moved into a smaller townhome. She said that downsizing hurt her pride, but that it felt good to be able to pay their bills without asking me. I told her I was proud of her. We also began attending counseling together through a program offered at the community center. The counselor helped us talk about our mutual hurt and expectations, and at one session, Monica finally apologized for forging the deed and for using Max to manipulate me. I cried quietly and told her I forgave her. I apologized for enabling her for so long and for not setting boundaries sooner. She said she had learned that when someone constantly rescues you, you don't develop resilience. It was a hard lesson for both of us. Over time, the trust I set up for Max became something we talked about openly. Monica asked about its terms, and I explained them. I said that if she continued to respect boundaries, I might consider adding provisions for her future, but that would depend on her consistent behavior. She understood, and she thanked me for still thinking of her even after everything. I told her that love doesn't disappear, but trust must be rebuilt. She nodded and wiped her eyes. In May, we celebrated Max's 8th birthday at a local park. I brought cupcakes and a picnic blanket, and Monica brought sandwiches. Alistair showed up late and kept his distance, but he did toss a football with Max for a few minutes. Max opened gifts under a shade tree, and when he unwrapped the science kit I bought him, he hugged me tightly and whispered that he loved experiments. I told him he could be anything he wanted to be. As we packed up, Monica handed me a small envelope containing a homemade Mother's Day card she had forgotten to give me the week before. Inside was a handwritten note thanking me for everything I had done and acknowledging that she had hurt me. She wrote that she was trying to be better. I cried as I read it later that night in my living room, the sound of sprinklers hissing outside. I realized that while I had lost the illusion that my daughter would never betray me, I had gained a more honest relationship with her, and I had regained my self-respect. That summer, I took Max to the library once a week, and we worked our way through the children's section. He loved books about space and dinosaurs, and we built model rockets at my kitchen table, using glue and patience. One afternoon, we stopped at a 7-Eleven for slushies after a hot day at the park, and the clerk recognized me from years of buying snacks for my nursing shifts. He asked how retirement was treating me, and I smiled and said it was busy in a different way. Max slurped his blue raspberry drink, the sugar staining his lips, and he told me he wanted to be an astronaut. I told him to aim high, but to always remember where he came from. He nodded solemnly. At home, we watched the evening news together, and a segment about elder financial abuse came on. I listened as the anchor discussed statistics, and I felt a chill at how common my story was. I silently vowed to continue sharing my experience so others wouldn't feel alone. In the fall, my church asked me to speak at a seniors' luncheon about setting boundaries with adult children. I hesitated, but then I agreed, because telling my story could help others. I spent days crafting my speech, careful to respect privacy, but honest about the pain and the healing. When the day came, I stood at the lectern in the fellowship hall, the smell of coffee and cinnamon rolls filling the air, and I took a deep breath. I told them about the text from my lawyer, the fraudulent deed, the confrontation at my kitchen table, and the long road back to trust. As I spoke, I saw heads nodding, eyes filling with tears, and I realized that this story wasn't just mine. It belonged to many of us who had given and finally learned to give to ourselves. I encouraged them to check their deeds, to read before signing, and to listen to their gut. After my talk, an older gentleman approached me and said his daughter had tried to get him to sign over his retirement account. He said my story gave him courage to say no. I hugged him and felt a wave of gratitude. In the months that followed, I received letters from viewers of Grace's stories who had watched my video when she invited me to share my story. They wrote to say they felt seen and I realized that community can spring up from the darkest of betrayals. I continued to mention Grace's channel to friends in my support group, telling them how hearing a similar tale there had propelled me into action. I told them we are stronger when we know we aren't the only ones. Eventually, a local journalist reached out and asked to interview me for an article on elder abuse. I agreed, because the more we talk about it, the less stigma there is. The article ran with a photo of me holding a coffee cup in my kitchen, my eyes determined. The reporter asked about the legal process, and I explained that probate and property issues can drag on, that state law gives a timeline of up to 1 year or 18 months, and that it's important to start planning early to avoid court altogether. I also mentioned the bank's policy requiring notice for large cash withdrawals, and I told readers that they should familiarize themselves with such rules. Knowledge is power, and small details can prevent big losses. As winter approached again, I sat by my window watching rain streak down, and I marveled at how much had changed in a year. I had gone from being someone's ATM to being my own advocate, from being manipulated to setting the agenda. Monica texted me that they had paid off a credit card for the first time, and she thanked me for teaching her to budget. The message made me smile because it was the first time she had thanked me for something other than money. Alistair stayed at a distance, and I accepted that. Some relationships cannot be repaired, and that's okay. My relationship with my daughter and grandson was what mattered most. At our next counseling session, Monica expressed gratitude for the trust I had established for Max. She said knowing his future was secure lifted a burden from her. I felt validated that my decision to cut her off financially, but provide for her son, had been the right one. In early January, my attorney sent me the annual statement for Max's trust. It listed the value of the assets, the investments, and the distributions for his educational enrichment. Seeing the numbers grow made me smile, because I knew that one day he would have resources without strings attached. My attorney also reminded me to file my own beneficiary designations on my retirement accounts and to review them every year. He said that small administrative tasks can prevent big headaches, and I dutifully updated the forms, naming the trust where appropriate. As I filled out the forms, I thought about how much I had learned. Terms like beneficiary, irrevocable, and probate had once sounded like a foreign language, but now they were tools I used to protect myself and my family. I also thought about the bank teller who had once quietly lowered her voice when she saw a large check I was about to deposit. She had asked if I was aware of the deposit hold times and told me that available funds might differ from the account balance. At the time, I found it annoying, but now I appreciated her caution. Throughout this journey, I learned that institutions like banks and courts move slowly, that investigations can take months, and that patience is part of protecting yourself. I learned to document everything and to trust professionals who respect me. I also learned that boundaries are a form of love. By saying no to Monica, I created space for her to grow. By refusing to pay for their mortgage, I forced them to face reality. By redirecting my resources to Max's trust, I ensured the next generation wouldn't be harmed by the mistakes of the current one. There were hard days when I missed the ease of handing over money to keep the peace. There were nights when I lay awake worrying about whether I was being cruel. But each day I reminded myself that enabling is not love and that my worth is not determined by my wallet. My support group continued to meet. and we celebrated each other's victories. One woman finally changed the locks on her house after her son started showing up unannounced. Another opened a separate bank account. Small steps, big transformations. In spring, I visited the local fair with Max. We rode the Ferris wheel and ate corn dogs, and I laughed until my sides hurt. As we circled high above the fairgrounds, he pointed at the tiny cars below and said everything looked so small. I nodded and thought about perspective. At that height, the problems of last year seemed distant, like little cars on a track. Up close, they were enormous, but with time and distance, they shrank. I hoped that one day Monica would look back and see our crisis as a turning point rather than a wound. I also realized that my story was still unfolding. There would be future tests, future boundaries to set, but I felt prepared. I had regained my dignity, and I would not surrender it again. Toward the end of the year, Max's school held a grandparents' day, and I was invited. I sat in his classroom surrounded by construction paper art and the buzz of excited children, and he proudly introduced me to his friends as his Nana who knows everything about rockets, and my heart swelled. I looked over and saw Monica standing in the doorway, watching me with a soft expression. She mouthed, "Thank you," and I nodded, tears prickling my eyes. In that moment, I knew the path we were on was hard, but worth it. As we left the school, Monica asked if I wanted to stop by a coffee shop on the way home. We went to Starbucks and ordered lattes, and she paid, a small but meaningful gesture that made me smile. We sat by the window and sipped our drinks, and she told me about a promotion at work. I listened and offered advice when she asked, but I didn't offer money. She didn't ask. We talked like adults. Outside, rain streaked the window, and I felt a peace I hadn't known in a long time. I realized that cutting her off financially had led to more authentic conversations, because there was no longer an unspoken expectation looming between us. As I sipped my latte, I thought back to the cold open of this saga, the text from my lawyer, the panic, the sense of betrayal, and I marveled at how far I had come, not just in repairing relationships, but in reclaiming myself. I also thought about all the watchers who might be hearing this story now, maybe while standing in their own kitchen or driving to a grocery store, wondering if they are being taken advantage of. I want to tell you this: trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. Talk to a professional, check your documents, and don't be afraid to set boundaries, even if it means short-term pain. Long-term dignity is worth it. Towards the end of the meeting, Monica asked if I wanted to come over on Sunday to help plant a garden. I accepted, and I felt a warmth that didn't come from the coffee. There was something healing about digging in the dirt together, about building something new. On Sunday, we planted tomatoes and peppers in her small backyard. Max dug holes and placed seedlings, and Alistair even joined in, handing us tools and not saying much. His presence was tentative, but it was there. As we worked, Monica mentioned that she had started following Grace's stories and had listened to other mothers' tales. She said it helped her see things from my perspective. I smiled because this open loop that had motivated me to tell my story was now connecting with her. After we finished, we sat on the patio and drank lemonade, and Monica said she had been reading about estate planning. She asked if I would review her own draft of a will. I agreed, proud that she was planning ahead instead of assuming she could rely on me. We went inside and looked at the document, and I offered gentle suggestions. She listed Max as her primary beneficiary and even mentioned a small donation to the community center that hosted our support group. I felt a spark of pride. I gently mentioned that she might want to talk to an attorney because while I had learned a lot, I wasn't a professional. She nodded and said she would schedule an appointment. Accountability was becoming a habit for her. By the time we left, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the freshly planted garden. Max hugged me goodbye and asked if I could come back next week. I promised I would. In the car ride home, I felt tired but content. The road ahead was long, but we were walking it. I realized that revenge, for me, had never been about causing them pain. It was about reclaiming my power and ensuring they couldn't harm me again. Cutting off their mortgage payments, setting up the trust, and drawing legal lines had been my revenge. But the real healing came from watching Monica grow. There is a satisfaction in seeing someone learn the lesson you hoped they would. There are still days when I feel a pang about what happened, and there are still moments when Alistair's anger surfaces and I have to set a hard boundary. But I no longer feel sick to my stomach when I think about my daughter. I know that my house is safe, my finances are secured, and my grandson's future is protected. I know that I can sip coffee at my kitchen table without worrying about hidden schemes. I know that I am no longer under anyone's thumb. I also know that there are other Suzannes out there, other women who have given their lives to their families and then been cast aside. If that's you, please hear me. You deserve respect, and it's never too late to take back your life. One evening, I sat on my porch swing and watched the neighborhood kids ride bikes, their laughter filling the air, and I realized that life in its simplest form is still good. We can endure betrayal and still find joy in the scent of jasmine and the taste of fresh coffee. I looked down at the deed to my house, now amended back to its rightful state, and I smiled. A piece of paper may not seem like much, but it represents decades of sweat, sacrifice, and stability. It represents my autonomy. From time to time, I catch Monica glancing at that deed when she visits. Maybe it reminds her of the line she crossed, or maybe it reminds her of the forgiveness she received. Either way, it stands as both a warning and a testament. There was a moment early on when I considered selling the house and moving into a retirement community, but I decided against it. This home holds memories and it holds me. I will leave it when I choose, not when someone tricks me into it. I installed a security sign in the yard, not because I fear break-ins, but because I value my peace of mind. The ADT sticker gleams under the porch light, another small step in my journey toward feeling safe in my own space. In the kitchen, I replaced the old fluorescent light with a warmer LED fixture from Lowe's, and the softer light made the room feel even more like the heart of my home. As I screwed in the bulbs, I thought about how we can choose what to illuminate and what to leave in shadow. I replaced the sagging couch in the living room with a comfortable recliner from Ashley Furniture, one that supports my back. I read books there and sometimes fall asleep with a blanket over my lap and Max's cat Whiskers purring at my feet. Monica surprised me on my birthday with a plant from her favorite nursery and a heartfelt card. She wrote that she had applied for a promotion and that she would let me know when she heard back. The card made me cry, not because of the words, but because of the thought behind them. In one letter, she wrote that she had started saving 20% of her paychecks, and she laughed at how responsible she had become. I replied that I was proud of her. It felt like we were both relearning our roles. Another afternoon, Alistair called to ask if I would consider co-signing on a new truck. I told him no without hesitation, and I reminded him that he already had a vehicle that worked. He hung up in a huff, but I didn't feel guilty. I realized that I no longer feared their anger. Their feelings were theirs to manage, just as my boundaries were mine to set. That realization tasted sweeter than any revenge could. I continued to watch Grace's stories, leaving comments about my progress, and sometimes the host would reply with encouragement. There is something powerful about being seen and acknowledged by someone who understands. It's a quiet salve for old wounds. On the anniversary of the text from my lawyer, I sent him a thank you note and a gift card to a coffee shop. I wrote that his quick action had saved me from losing my house and that I appreciated his guidance. He responded with a smiley face and told me to keep in touch. He also reminded me to keep my estate documents updated and to inform the trustee of any changes. I scheduled a review for later that year. Staying proactive had become part of my routine. As time marched on, the intensity of the betrayal faded. The memory remained, but it no longer consumed me. It became a story I told not to relive the pain, but to celebrate the resilience. The final twist, if you can call it that, came when Monica called to tell me she was expecting another baby. She sounded nervous, as if she feared I would assume she was asking for money. Instead, she asked if I would come with her to a doctor's appointment because Alistair had to work. I agreed, and as I sat in the waiting room with her, watching other expectant mothers rub their bellies, I felt a wave of tenderness. Life goes on, new lives begin, and cycles have a way of repeating unless we break them. On the drive home, Monica admitted she had been scared to tell me because she didn't want me to think she would rely on me to raise another child. She said she wanted to do things differently this time. I told her that acknowledging that was a good sign. We talked about baby names, about the joys and fears of motherhood, and I told her about how when she was born I counted all her fingers and toes and kissed her forehead. She smiled, and for a moment the weight of the past lifted. Max, now 9, was excited about being a big brother. He made lists of things he would teach the baby. He wrote down how to ride a bike and how to make a volcano for science class and how to be nice to Nana. I laughed and hugged him, and I realized that our story, messy as it was, had brought us to this moment of laughter and hope, and that perhaps is the greatest revenge against betrayal, building a life so full of love and boundaries that the betrayal shrinks in comparison. So if you're still listening, thank you. Thank you for letting me share my journey from shock to strength. If you're standing on your own cliff, looking into the abyss of family betrayal, know this: you can step back, you can build a fence, and you can plant a garden on your own terms. Remember to check your deeds, read your bank policies, and don't sign anything without understanding it. Remember that California requires both parties to consent to recordings, and that probate can take up to a year or 18 months. Remember that banks may require armored carriers for large withdrawals. These aren't just facts, they're tools. And if your adult child uses your grandchild as leverage, remember that punishing a child to manipulate a parent is a choice they'll have to live with. You cannot control their choices, but you can control your response. Choose dignity. As for me, I'll be spending the next few months teaching Max how to sew a button and change a tire, teaching Monica how to balance a checkbook and cook pot roast, and teaching myself how to accept love without strings. The story continues, but I'm the one writing it now. Thank you for listening to my story. Please leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from, and share your thoughts. Your support means more than you know. And if you're reading this late at night with a cup of tea and a heavy heart, know that there's a community of us out here quietly cheering you on. We may have been hurt, but we are not defeated. We are still here, still loving, still learning. Good night, and may you find the courage to set the boundaries you deserve. This is Suzanne, signing off with hope in my heart and peace in my home. But it turned out the story didn't end there. Closure has a way of inviting new beginnings, and one morning a certified letter bearing the county clerk's seal appeared in my mailbox, stark and official, and my hands shook as I slid a knife along the envelope. Inside was a notification that my name had been flagged as a potential victim in a fraud investigation connected to property transfers, and the line that said, "Please contact the district attorney's office," made my mouth go dry because even after everything, the word victim still stung. I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where Monica had once demanded I sign papers, and I reread the letter, my mind racing as I wondered whether this was some bureaucratic delay or a sign that the district attorney had discovered other unauthorized transactions I hadn't noticed. I dialed the number provided and was patched through to an investigator who spoke with a clipped efficiency, and he asked me if I had recently filed any quitclaim deeds on my property. When I said no, he sighed and said that a forged filing had been submitted under my name again. He explained that the county's new system flagged the submission because the digital signature didn't match previous samples. And while a part of me was relieved that the system worked, another part was furious that someone, likely Monica or Alistair, had the audacity to try a second time. The investigator asked if I would be willing to give a statement and provide handwriting samples, and he said that the district attorney planned to pursue charges for forgery and fraud. Hearing those words made my stomach flip because I had spent months trying to avoid criminal charges against my own child. But I realized that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting other seniors in our community from being manipulated and defrauded by people who saw them as easy targets. And I told him yes, I would cooperate fully, because someone had to stand up for those who were too scared to speak. That decision opened a new chapter of conflict, because when news of the investigation reached Monica and Alistair, their anger erupted like a pent-up storm, and they accused me of trying to ruin their lives. I reminded them that they had attempted to steal my home, and that accountability was not vengeance. It was justice. At night I could feel the weight of that line between justice and revenge pressing on my chest, and I wondered if I was truly ready to see my daughter face criminal consequences. But then I'd remember the look on Max's face when he realized his mother had put his stability at risk. My attorney assured me that cooperating with the district attorney didn't necessarily mean Monica would go to jail, but that it would force her to reckon with the seriousness of her actions. Still, the open loop of a potential courtroom testimony kept me awake, the tick of the wall clock louder than usual. Meanwhile, the investigator asked me to gather any additional documents showing payments to Monica and Alistair over the years, because he wanted to establish a pattern of financial dependency. So I pulled out dusty folders, tax returns, and checkbook ledgers, reliving each time I had bailed them out, and my anger simmered anew. Each canceled check told a story. The mortgage payment I sent to the bank when they were 3 months behind, the emergency fund I wired when Alistair claimed his truck broke down, the credit card bill Monica had me pay after a weekend trip to Las Vegas that she later called work-related. As I highlighted the dates and wrote notes, I felt like I was building a case, not against my family, but against a pattern of entitlement that had grown over years. It was like laying out breadcrumbs that led to the moment my lawyer texted me, and the trail was longer than I wanted to admit. In a strange way, gathering those documents was therapeutic. I could see the evidence of my generosity and the ways it had been taken for granted, and it helped me release the shame that had clung to me, because it wasn't my kindness that was wrong, it was their exploitation of it. Still, I worried about Max. I didn't want him to be hurt by whatever happened in the courts, so I met with a child psychologist to ask how to talk to a 7-year-old about his parents' potential legal trouble. The doctor told me to be honest but age-appropriate, and to reassure him that he was loved and safe. I practiced what I would say, repeating words like consequences and choices until they felt less sharp, and I decided that when the time came, I would tell Max that everyone has to follow rules to keep people safe, and that sometimes adults forget and have to make things right. All the while, Monica and Alistair continued to use Max as leverage. They hinted that if I cooperated with the district attorney, they would move away and change schools, effectively cutting me out. The threat hung in the air, heavy and mean, and I had to remind myself that a healthy relationship shouldn't depend on my silence. One evening, while stirring a pot of Campbell's tomato soup on the stove, I looked at the steam curling up and thought about all the times I had made simple meals like this while juggling my own bills and their crises, and I wondered if they even remembered how much love went into those small acts. The smell of simmering tomatoes mingled with the faint scent of lemon-scented dish soap, grounding me. I took a deep breath and decided that I would not let fear or guilt cook my decisions anymore. I would do what was right and trust that Max would someday understand why his grandmother took a stand. At this point, I felt like I was living multiple timelines. In one, I was a young mother again, scraping by with 2 jobs and a toddler. In another, I was a retired nurse learning legal jargon. And in a third, I was a grandmother building a future for a boy whose innocence I wanted to preserve. To keep my sanity, I started journaling, writing down each conversation with the district attorney's office, each interaction with Monica, and each of my own feelings. On paper, patterns emerged, and I began to see how even now Monica would pivot from apology to accusation to tears in a single phone call, manipulating my empathy like a dial. One afternoon, I wrote about a memory from when Monica was 9 and came home with a permission slip for a field trip. I couldn't afford the fee that week, so I called the school, embarrassed, and asked if there was a payment plan. They said yes, but Monica refused to go if she couldn't have spending money for souvenirs. That memory had always made me feel guilty, as if I had failed her by not providing enough. But writing it down now, I saw that entitlement had roots, and I wondered if my shame had prevented me from teaching her the difference between wants and needs. On another page, I wrote about her senior year of high school when she crashed my old Toyota Camry, lied about it to avoid consequences, and then cried when the insurance rates went up. I paid the deductible, of course, but I also took note of how easily she shifted blame to the world around her. Connecting these dots wasn't about demonizing her. It was about understanding how we arrived at this moment, so I could prevent the same patterns from repeating with Max. I didn't want him to grow up thinking that love meant never facing consequences. As the days passed, I met with my attorney to prepare my official statement, and I learned about how the legal process would unfold, that the district attorney would gather evidence and decide whether to press charges, and that I might be called to testify. The thought of taking the stand against my daughter made my knees weak. He reminded me that California is a two-party consent state, meaning we couldn't secretly record Monica without her knowing, and that everything we did needed to be above board. I appreciated his steady guidance like a lighthouse beam cutting through the fog of my emotions. He also mentioned that the bank might freeze accounts associated with the fraudulent deed, so I called my bank and asked about their policies. The manager told me that for large withdrawals, they could require advance notice and even an armored car delivery, a detail that made me realize just how elaborate theft prevention had become. Talking to the bank reminded me of the earlier scramble when I had discovered that Monica had added herself to my accounts. I had closed those accounts and reopened new ones, and I had placed alerts for any transaction over a certain amount. Now, those safeguards felt like seatbelts on a winding mountain road. Through it all, I kept watching Grace's stories, not just for entertainment, but for solidarity. One video featured a woman whose son forged her signature on a loan, and her calm recounting of how she confronted him gave me a blueprint for my own interactions, and it motivated me to keep sharing my story. In the comments section of that video, I saw people from all over the country, Texas, Ohio, Florida, sharing their own experiences, and I realized that this problem wasn't isolated. There was a quiet epidemic of adult children taking advantage of their parents, and our stories could help each other. One comment that stuck with me read, "Justice served cold." Another said, "She deserved better." And I took those words as reminders that I wasn't crazy for demanding respect. It's funny how validation from strangers can feel like a warm quilt on a cold night. As the investigation progressed, the district attorney's office subpoenaed bank records and digital submission logs from the county recorder. They found that the attempted quitclaim had been filed from an IP address associated with Alistair's business, and the digital signature had been created using a free trial software. The evidence was damning. When confronted, Alistair denied everything, of course. He claimed his computer had been hacked, that maybe it was a disgruntled former client. Monica echoed him, her voice dripping with indignation, but neither could explain why the forged deed also included their correct legal names and addresses. At the same time, tension around Max's access increased. They started limiting our visits to supervised outings at public parks, watching my interactions with suspicion, as if I might try to poison their son with cautionary tales. I stayed cheerful and kept our conversations about homework and soccer to protect him from the adult drama swirling around. Then, as if the universe wanted to test my resolve, I received another curveball. My late husband, Paul's brother, Uncle Jerry, called from Arizona to say he had been served with a subpoena related to the property case. Apparently, Alistair had tried to rope Jerry into testifying that Paul had intended the house to pass to Monica. I hadn't spoken to Jerry in years, and hearing his gravelly voice took me back to the days when Paul and I would host backyard barbecues with his side of the family, their laughter mixing with the scent of charcoal and the hum of cicadas. Now those memories were weaponized. Jerry told me that he had refused to lie and that he felt sick to his stomach thinking that his niece would involve him in something so shady. He apologized for not reaching out sooner, saying he didn't know how to help. I thanked him, feeling both grateful and sad that we were reconnecting under such circumstances. That call led me to another realization. Betrayal doesn't just fracture immediate relationships, it ripples outward, stirring old grief, old alliances, and old wounds. Each person touched by it has to decide whether to ignore the wave or ride it toward honesty. By the time fall crept in, with leaves crunching underfoot and pumpkin spice-scented candles flickering in my kitchen, the district attorney had enough evidence to present the case to a grand jury. My attorney said there was a strong chance they would issue an indictment for forgery and attempted fraud. My heart pounded as he explained that an indictment would mean Monica and Alastair would be formally charged and would have to appear in court. I imagined them in handcuffs, and the image made me nauseous. Despite everything, they were still family, and seeing them in that position would break something in me. I considered asking the district attorney to drop the case, to spare Max the trauma of seeing his parents go through a trial. But then I thought about the other victims whose abusers were never held accountable, and I realized that backing down would send a message that older adults could be trampled on without consequence. To process these conflicting feelings, I joined a support group for seniors who had been financially abused. We met in the community center on Wednesday afternoons, sitting in a circle of metal folding chairs, our hands wrapped around paper cups of Folgers coffee, sharing stories that mirrored mine in startling detail. There was a retired postal worker who had discovered her son was taking out credit cards in her name. There was a widower whose niece had convinced him to sign over his rental property. We nodded, empathized, and learned from each other. The shared understanding lightened the burden, turning isolation into solidarity. In that group, a woman named Gloria told me that she had testified against her grandson when he forged her checks. She said the trial was painful, but that seeing him held accountable actually gave him the wake-up call he needed to enter rehab and get his life together. Her story gave me hope that accountability can be a form of love. Each time I left those meetings, I felt a little stronger, like my spine had been stiffened. And when Monica called to scream at me for dragging the family through the mud, I no longer crumpled. I let her words wash over me, a cold shower reminding me why boundaries were necessary. As we waited for the grand jury's decision, the seasons shifted again. Winter rains soaked the sidewalks, and I spent more time inside, crocheting blankets for the church's outreach program and listening to the ticking of the clock. The quiet gave me space to reflect on my childhood long before Monica. I remembered sitting at my own mother's kitchen table in a small town outside San Diego, watching her roll out pie crusts for the holidays while talking about budgets. She taught me to save pennies in a jar labeled rainy day, and she drilled into me that a woman needs to know where her money goes. Those lessons carried me through nursing school, through buying my first house, through raising Monica as a single mom after Paul passed away. I realized that in trying to shield Monica from the scarcity I grew up with, I may have robbed her of the chance to learn the satisfaction of earning her own stability. This thought both hurt and comforted me. Hurt because I saw my hand in creating this mess. Comforted because if my choices had contributed to the problem, then my choices could help correct it. I couldn't change the past, but I could change my response moving forward. During one rainy afternoon, I pulled out old photo albums. I ran my fingers over the sticky plastic covers, each page holding a snapshot of a life lived in stages. There was Monica at 3 with icing smeared across her cheeks, There was Paul holding her up to touch the ornaments on our first Christmas tree. Flipping through those albums, I felt both nostalgic and melancholy. The images told a story of a family that once felt solid, anchored by small rituals like Sunday pancakes and Saturday trips to the hardware store. Then Paul's diagnosis came like a lightning bolt, splitting our sense of security in two. Paul had been a lineman for the electric company, broad-shouldered and gentle, and his cancer moved fast. He was gone within 6 months, leaving me a widow at 38 with a teenage daughter and a mountain of medical bills. Those bills were why I took extra shifts and delayed my own grief. Monica handled Paul's death by immersing herself in her friends and cheerleading, avoiding home as much as possible. I tried to respect her need for space, but sometimes I would find myself staring at her empty chair at the dinner table, my fork hovering over meatloaf, tears threatening to spill. When she graduated high school, she announced that she wanted to attend an expensive out-of-state college. I gently suggested community college for the first year to save money, but she accused me of not believing in her dreams. To avoid a fight, I co-signed on student loans far bigger than my annual salary. Within 2 semesters, she dropped out, citing unfair professors and homesickness. The loans didn't disappear, though, and I added them to the list of monthly bills. Each month, as I wrote checks in neat cursive, I wondered if I had done the right thing by rescuing her yet again. After college, she bounced from job to job, always complaining that her bosses were incompetent, that she deserved more. When she met Alistair at a friend's barbecue, she was smitten by his confidence and his talk of business ventures. I mistook his arrogance for ambition, and I gave my blessing without looking deeper. At their wedding, held in a rented vineyard with white folding chairs and mason jar centerpieces, I toasted to their future. I remember Alistair's father making a joke about marrying up and everyone laughing. I didn't realize how prophetic those words would become. Soon after the wedding, Monica and Alistair moved into a 2-story house in a gated community, financed by a subprime mortgage that ballooned after the introductory rate ended. When the first balloon payment hit, they called me in tears, and I wrote a check to cover it, telling myself it was a one-time emergency. But emergencies became patterns. Their credit cards were always maxed. Their cars always needed repairs. There was always a reason they were on the edge, and each time they dangled Max in front of me like a carrot, promising that I could babysit if I helped them. Looking back, I see that my fear of losing access to my grandchild overpowered my common sense. I had never set boundaries with Monica, so when I finally did by cutting them off, it felt like an earthquake to all of us. They didn't know how to respond to a mother who said no. As the grand jury date approached, these memories swirled through my mind like leaves in the wind, each one a reminder of a misstep or a compromise. I could not rewrite the past, but I could narrate it honestly, perhaps to help another mother avoid the same traps. The evening before the grand jury convened, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun dip behind the hills, painting the sky in pink and gold. I thought about Paul, imagined him sitting next to me, his calloused hand on my knee, and I whispered into the twilight, "Help me do the right thing." The next morning, my attorney and I sat in a windowless waiting room at the courthouse, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the smell of stale coffee permeating the air. I clutched my purse strap and listened as my name was called. My testimony before the grand jury was under oath and confidential, but I can say this: it was the hardest thing I've done. I described how I trusted Monica and Alistair, how I signed papers I didn't fully understand, how I had paid their bills and watched as they still tried to steal the only home I had left. I kept my voice steady, even when tears threatened. I answered questions about my handwriting and the timeline with as much detail as I could. When I left the courthouse, I felt drained, like someone had wrung every bit of moisture from me, yet there was also a sense of relief, as if speaking the truth out loud had released a pressure valve. The waiting game resumed, but at least my part was done. 3 days later, my attorney called to tell me the grand jury had indicted both Monica and Alistair on charges of forgery and attempted grand theft. Hearing those words out loud made the situation undeniably real. There would be an arraignment, bail hearings, and if they didn't plead out, a trial. Monica called me that night, her voice shaking. She vacillated between begging me to drop everything and blaming Alistair for orchestrating the whole thing. I listened quietly and then told her that I loved her, but I could not shield her from consequences, and that maybe this was the wake-up call she needed to rebuild her life honestly. She hung up on me, but for the first time I didn't feel shattered. I felt firm, like bedrock. I had said my piece and the rest was out of my hands. In the following weeks, I prepared for the possibility of a public trial. I updated the passwords on my devices and installed a Ring doorbell for extra security, because my attorney warned me to expect harassment or attempted intimidation. I also asked a neighbor to accompany me to court dates just so I wasn't alone. At one point, Alistair tried to contact me through a third party, a mutual acquaintance from church. The acquaintance came to my door, hat in hand, asking me to reconsider. He said Alistair was distraught and that the whole thing was a misunderstanding. I responded that a misunderstanding doesn't result in forged legal documents submitted to the county. My bank sent me updated notices showing that the fraudulent documents had been expunged from the record and that my property title was clear. Seeing my name alone on the deed felt like reclaiming something intangible, my autonomy, my dignity, my future. I placed the deed in a fireproof safe along with my will and trust documents. I hope my story encourages you to check your deeds, update your wills, review your bank policies, and to talk to your loved ones about boundaries early and often. I hope it reminds you that you are not alone, that there is a community of us, strangers bound by similar experiences, cheering each other on. Thank you for walking this path with me through every twist and turn, through every open loop and resolution. If you're listening with your heart racing because you see yourself in my story, know that calm is possible. Justice can be done without vengeance, and love can coexist with accountability. As always, I invite you to share your thoughts and tell me where you're listening from. Your comments not only help the algorithm, but also remind me that storytelling can build bridges. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have cooperated with the district attorney? Would you have cut off your child sooner? I genuinely want to know. And one final note, if you ever receive a text from your lawyer that says, "Call me immediately," take it seriously, but also take a deep breath. Gather your documents, gather your courage, and remember that you are stronger and smarter than those who underestimate you. Good night or good morning, wherever you are. This is Suzanne from Orange County, California, wishing you peace, strength, and the kind of love that never has to be bought or bargained for.